Hey everyone, good afternoon. This is Joseph Thomas from mTrust HR, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on remote I-9 verification. Now, we have a great program for you today, but before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over first. First off, the webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a recording after the webinar. And attendees will be in listen-only mode, but if there are any questions, please feel free to write them down in the questions tab, and our panelists will make sure to answer them. And finally, all the slides and supporting documents from the webinar will be available to download from the Handouts tab. All right, perfect. Now I'd like to introduce Dawn Standerwick, one of the VPs of our trusted partner, ESR.
Thank you, Joseph. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today joining mTrust for this timely webinar. As Joseph indicated, my name is Dawn Standerwick, and I'm with Employment Screening Resources. We're a global background screening firm that works closely with mTrust. The unprecedented effects of COVID-19 have affected employers and their ability to meet legal obligations related to their I-9 processes. The good news is that employers do have options and some alternate ways to ensure compliance with I-9 requirements during this pandemic. So thank you, mTrust, for hosting this webinar. Before we jump in, I'm going to give the requisite disclaimer that this webinar is intended for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. There are varying regulatory conditions across the US, and as such, we recommend that you consult with your trusted legal counsel to review your policies and practices. Back to you, Joseph.
All right, thank you, Dawn. So I'd like to introduce everyone to our main speakers for today. We have Thomas Matthew, who is the Senior Director of mTrust HR. And we have Philip Santos, one of our talented solutions experts on I-9 and the onboarding process. And for the agenda for today, we'll be going over the Form I-9 updates and new version changes, the updated DHS guidance on remote verification, as well as several remote verification options, and what we believe to be the best practices for remote I-9 compliance. And we'll pass it over for Thomas to kick it off.
Okay. Before we get started, thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Dawn and Joseph, for that introduction. And for those of you who are joining us today, I hope all of you are keeping safe, working well. Obviously, a lot of us are remotely in. And so before we get started, just a quick little poll just to get people started with the process here. I'm going to launch a quick poll, and if you can answer that, that will kind of help us, in terms of understanding, where you're coming from and, what are you looking to do in the next couple of months or so, how is remote work affecting you and so on. And we're going to share these results with you. So we're going to give everybody maybe a couple of seconds more to actually get your answers in, right? And if you're like me with cabin fever, I can tell you that I'm looking forward to going back to normal, so hopefully we get a chance to work back with our colleagues again. I'm going to close out the poll, but thank you for all of you that has responded. I think we have a couple more people yet to, still in the process of voting, and I'm going to just make sure that we give them the time to actually respond to this question. Okay, all right. Thank you. We appreciate you providing that little feedback. Let's start by sharing that poll out to you so you can see what that poll looks like, right? So you can see what that poll looks like. So a larger percentage of you does seem to love working from home, and that's really great to know. And let's go on, actually move on to our next question here, which is another poll. And this is just to understand how you're coping with the COVID-19 situation in terms of your hiring solutions right now. Are you seeing a freeze? Are you seeing more people actually holding back on it? Wonderful. I just love the fact that so many of you are actually voting through the process. It shows we have an engaged audience, and that's really great to see. I think you will like the program that we have for you today. Obviously, a lot of notes. And for those of you who really want to download a copy of that handout, we have provided two types of documents here. One is a copy of the slide. And then we have also provided the formal USCIS guidance, which is part of their web release that is also available as a PDF. You can access both of these documents and other supporting documents in the handout tab. So having said that, I'm going to actually close out the poll here. Thanks for all of you that actually voted. And we're going to share the recent effects of that poll out to you. Okay? So it's kind of a mixed bag right now. I think a larger majority is saying that there's most probably a reduction in your hiring. So it's being projected right now. And that's no surprise, because if you look at the number of people that has been so badly affected, this is really heartbreaking in a lot of ways, but hopefully we all come out stronger at the end of it, and we can absolutely see what we can do in terms of providing guidance from it. All right, so having said that, let's go back into what some of these challenges are, right? So the first thing we want to start out with is, maybe most of you are aware there's a new form I-9 out, okay? And hopefully you should actually see what that actually looks like in just a second here. So the new form version, as you know, is actually came out, I think it came out a couple of months ago, but the actual expiration date for your current form is has been absolutely stated that it is April the 30th. Starting on May 1st, all employers must actually use the new form. Okay. Now, for those of you who are current clients, we are lucky enough to have some great clients who are working with us over the last 10 years or so. And it's been a great pleasure to work with you. For those of you who want to know, when is the new Form I-9 completed? When is it going to be updated? It is going to be updated in our system automatically. For those of you who are used to electronic I-9 process or currently using the remote I-9 process, there's no changes in functionality or to the processes other than some updated help documents and some new videos that we are actually posting out. So the big takeaway is that there are no major changes or functional changes to the form. The new section, the new edition of the form does list additional countries in the country drop-down box and then section in the country of issuance field. It also provides additional clarification on who can actually act as an authorized representative on behalf of the employee. And that is very important to highlight today, right? Because the majority of you that you're looking to complete a remote I-9, we need to understand what an authorized representative can do for you and what they cannot do for you, and what's the best way that they can actually complete Section 2 when they're reviewing a document, right? Other minor changes that you will see is a clarification on acceptable documents, updated procedures, including a DHS privacy notice, and a new website address that they can go to for any clarifications. Now, Don, some of the basics are still the same. Would you like to maybe talk through what some of the still compliance basics of the Form I-9 is?
Sure. So we see here the standard requirements that we're all accustomed to as part of our typical I-9 processes. So just as kind of a reminder, the Form I-9 must be completed within 3 days of the employee's start date. And Section 2 of the I-9 requires that certain steps be completed by the employer to validate the employee's identity and work authorization, including the review of the permitted documents to ensure that they are genuine and current or not unexpired. As part of this process, the employee must be physically present. And finally, the person who examines those documents must complete and sign off on Section 2.
Okay.
So next, let's take a look at the updated guidance from USCIS in light of COVID-19. And Thomas, talk to us about what has changed and the options that employers have available to them to consider.
Okay. Well, the exciting news is that the USCIS on March 20th actually brought out some enhanced additional guidance, especially because of the national emergency. And a lot of the first states having what you call stay-at-home orders, and are increasingly a larger number of our workforce working remotely, right? And this is a recognition that much has changed very rapidly for all companies in the last 60 days or so. We are all in a very unexpected place. But the first takeaway is that this is a temporary measure, right? And if you look at the language that they have stated in their, in that notice, right? It is for a period of 60 days from that March 20th date, or within 3 business days after the termination of the national emergency, whichever comes first, right? So this is a temporary workaround for those of you who cannot physically verify an employee's document for Section 2. This is only within this period. Now, if the national emergency is extended, chances are that dates are also going to be extended, right? But the most important takeaway is that there are certain requirements that must be met even if you are completing this remotely with an employee, right? Now, this can only apply, number one, if you are going to have the employees work remotely. This is a new policy. You updated your guidelines and your HR policies to state because of the COVID-19 emergency, we're going to have people work remotely, and because they cannot do that, this is why we are doing that, right? So you want to make sure that you have a policy in place, that it doesn't normally apply for a company that might actually be working remotely on a regular basis, but employees are physically present in a building. So for example, in a manufacturing floor where you have the ability to verify in person, there are no exceptions being implemented, though they have left it a little bit vague, and they have said that on a case-by-case basis, they may grant some exceptions. Now that's on a case-by-case basis, granted on the individual discretion of the person that may actually be the inspector or the auditor. And that is not something that typically most companies like to take a risk with, right? What are the other things that they have noticed, right? So as a company, you can exercise discretion to defer the physical presence of the employee in person, right? Now, but you still have to remotely verify this employee's document in 3 days. That means you're required to obtain either in a couple of ways. What they have said is that you can obtain it with an email, with a video conferencing call. If you're taking a video conferencing, I would suggest that you have a recording of the document. It's always a good policy to have that employee scan a copy and send it to you, so you have a physical record that you can actually attach with your physical I-9, if that's how you're going to do this. Retain copies of the document, and you must do it within the same 3-day window. So if they were starting out this Monday, remember they have 3 business days. You have 3 business days to actually physically verify the document by seeing the document if you're not seeing the person. So that has to be done for you to actually complete this little section, right? Now, it does not require that you have the employee physically be present, right? You can remotely verify this. But once you return back to normal operations, it also provides an additional burden on you, right? That you still have to go through that physical verification and actually update the I-9s. Your paper I-9s that you might have done must be properly annotated, saying that you are now physically verified. So let's take a look at what those requirements are, right? Now, the first time that you actually remotely verify them, you have to enter COVID-19 as the reason for the physical explanation delay in Section 2. Within Section 2, right next to your Section 1, there will be a little box which says additional information. Towards the end of Section 2, you have to update that section saying COVID-19 on there. Once the employee comes back to the plant or comes back to your workplace, for example, you have to actually update it with another note saying that the documents have now been physically examined, right? Along with the date that that examination happened within the system, right? So there are 2 requirements here. One is on the initial one that you actually put COVID-19 in the additional section. Secondly, when the employees come back and you can physically safely verify these documents with the person, you have to say physically verified along with the date of inspection in Section 2, okay? Now, it also says that you should have this as a policy, right? So those of you are not used to updating a policy or never had an I-9 policy, it's a nice, it's a good time to go back and talk to your legal team members to say, do we have an I-9 policy? Have we outlined what the basis of an I-9 policy should be for your company as such, right? But within that must be the reason, due to the COVID-19 situation, we are allowing companies to work during this time period of national emergency. And this is a burden that solely rests with the employer, okay? Now, if you want to go back and actually refer to the guidelines, we have actually provided 2 additional sources. The first source is the actual news release that we have provided. The second option is actually a question and answer session that is very informative, that can answer most of your questions that you might have. So if you go and take a look at the USCIS.co, go to the I-9 Central, look at the question and answers related to the temporary policies for Form I-9 and E-Verify, that has got a breadth of material that can help you with a majority of the questions that you may encounter because you happen to be working remotely, okay? Now, if you look at the remote verify options within this process, the employee will still complete section 1 on the first day that they actually join the company. So if you had a start date, that is their start date, they must complete section 1 within that date, right? They will send a copy of the documents. You will fix a time with them, typically in most cases that we see, for you to actually either do a conference call with the employee or actually get a copy of it and use that to update section 2. Once the termination or the lifting of the temporary orders are lifted, and you resume your operations, you will complete it. So this is the first option. This is a temporary workaround. What are other options available for you? And this is really interesting, that one of the guidelines that they brought out with that news release was the ability for them to emphasize, you should maybe take a look at completing all of this with a remote agent or an authorized representative, typically called a remote agent in the way that we normally speak about the process, because they may not be a direct employee, right? So in this case, a remote agent or an authorized representative will review the documents and complete section 2. This is a process that was existing, but maybe not paid so much of attention because you never had to use it until this time of national emergency that we are seeing right now, okay? Now, if you're doing section 1, these are some of the best practices that we can typically recommend. First of all, determine whether you qualify, right? So if you are affected and your policies have been updated, reflected, then you can definitely use this remote option because of the emergency option that you have, okay? We typically recommend that you have a physical copy sent to you by the employee that will establish their identity and work authorization. So typically, we prefer a fax, instead of a fax or a video conferencing. The recommended process may be better for you because you have a physical record of that it came in. You have a copy that you can print out, and that can also be attached with the employee's I-9. So that's a better process than a video chat conference where you saw something, and unless you're making a recording, you have no way of storing that, and actually making it available for somebody else to review. So we think the best process is an email, but these other options are things that the USCIS is also saying you can do. You must still do this within 3 days. That's the most important takeaway. There's no relaxation of that guideline because of the fact that you have a remote work situation right now. We recommend that you maintain a list of these employees that might have been verified using this remote option. Why? Because when you come back to normal operations, you want to go through the second step, which is the physical verification with that employee and creating that additional requirements or actually marking those additional sections in that section 2 of the document that you physically examined it. We also recommend that you send a calendar or a to-do list to say, here are the employees that I need to do. So if you're the only HR person in charge of your office who's doing this, it gives you an idea of, okay, I might not want to miss out. Let's go make sure that we go out and actually complete section 2 the right way related to the situation within the system. So in terms of our second set of options here, what is a remote agent verification? So this is the second option, which has always been very popular, maybe not so used so much till this actual emergency came into place. But a lot of companies have used remote agents very successfully to complete Section 2, especially in the IT, telecommunications, or in other spheres where people are working remotely, where you never got to meet them. This is already in use, and you have the ability to take advantage of that to actually make sure that you still stay compliant with the USCIS and the DHS requirements to completion of the I-9, right? So if you look at some of these requirements here, you can designate pretty much anybody to complete it on your behalf. You're still liable as an employer for any mistakes that that the authorized agent or the remote agent will do. Now, they could be anybody, right? One of those recommendations is that it could be other HR professionals, local librarians, an attorney, an accountant, even notaries, or even friends and family, right? Typically, the friends and family is not an option because of the ability, because of the conflict of interest, let me put it that way. But in this emergency situation, they have also updated guidelines to say that you can also use a friends and a family option, if you wanted to use it to do complete Section 2. We recently had a case where we had somebody actually go out and do a remote agent. They authorized their neighbor, and the neighbor came back and said, hey, I don't feel so good about doing it because you're going to come to my home and I have to examine your documents, so I don't want to do that. So even in this situation, there are people who might have a lot of fear and anxiety related to entertaining somebody at home. It's a very natural fear. So if there is no other option for you, to meet with somebody because some of those offices might be closed, you don't have an option. The friends and family, a spouse who can independently verify, who can actually attest to Section 2 that they have actually verified, that is something that you may want to consider. Right? Now, the big takeaway is that you can actually designate an authorized representative to act on your behalf to complete Section 2. Right? Now, it could be any person, right? Including a relative, a friend, a co-worker, a manager that typically may not actually see this, right? You're still liable, like I mentioned, so we want to highlight that even if you're doing it and you receive a copy back from the employee which has been scanned in, make sure that you actually can verify all of that is actually completed correctly, because you want to catch a mistake, right before, and actually send it back to them to make that correction if you need to. So make sure that you actually take a look at that completed I-9 if you're using that second option. For people using our electronic I-9 process, this is fully automated. In which case we are doing all of the data validations, all of the rule validations. So this becomes a more automated process. But some of you that may physically still send it out to an employee or to a manager or a co-worker, or maybe ask somebody in their family to complete it, you definitely have that as an option. But let's make sure that when you get that back, you actually take a look at it, because you don't want to be liable for a mistake within the system. Things to pay attention to, right? So if they were a US permanent resident, for example, did they put the A number on that Section 2, or did they take the back of the card and actually put that 10-digit number followed by, the service center that their case was actually being processed at? Little mistakes that, normally a person who are not trained on it may not catch, but you will be able to catch it. The same thing goes with EAD extensions. So making sure that you have that ability to look at Section 2, to take a look at what potential mistakes are being made if you're doing this physically instead of electronically, is another option for you to take a look at. Okay. Now for this section here, we do have some options here, right? And for some of the sections here, what I'm actually going to do is that I'm going to hand it to my colleague here, Philip Santos, who's one of our experts on our panelist here today, who can walk you through somewhat what some of these options are related to Section 2 completion with the remote agent, because it reduces some burden on you, it reduces the burden for you to have to follow up. And let's take a look at some of these options. So Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to all of our attendees that are joining us today. We really appreciate your time here. Going back to that slide there, if you do choose to have an authorized representative complete Section 2 on your behalf as the employer, as HR, right? You kind of have several different options, and it's when you think about it, it's really pretty incredible that we have so much support around this remote verification process. So just outlining some of the scenarios here. Option 1, the employer themselves, HR can choose to designate the agent who will be the reviewer for someone's particular I-9, right? So really in this scenario, it's you, the HR person, maybe you know somebody offhand, or maybe in this case, it's a manager that works, out in the field, maybe at a warehouse, but they're not normally in HR, not normally involved in the verification process, but you as the employer would like to designate that person to be the reviewer for Section 2, right? So that's the first option. The second option, as Thomas has mentioned, is that maybe we can have the employee designate who their authorized representative will be. And this is really useful. For example, if this particular employee is completely, rural, they've been hired to work remotely, and they're based, in maybe a rural area where they don't have access to a busy metropolitan area with lots of notary agents or something like that. Maybe we want to allow them, as the employer, we want to allow the employee to go ahead and designate, somebody close to them that they could, have their Section 2, their documents reviewed for Section 2, sorry. Especially, in the current situation with COVID, I think, as Thomas mentioned, there are a lot of people that may be wary, nervous, anxious to really go out. So maybe, some of our employees, maybe they have a roommate who they're, sharing the living situation with that could verify their documents. This is certainly a viable option here as well. The third option is that there are, in this day and age, there are basically complete facilities nationwide, designated centers that provide this service with highly trained, knowledgeable reviewers, people that are experienced in reviewing I-9 records and, documents and completing Section 2, right? So these are very knowledgeable experts here, and they're trained on how to do this process, but they are part of this large nationwide network, this group of facilities, to where the nice part is the employee can actually self-schedule their appointment, pick the day and the time to go visit this center within a certain radius of their zip code, right? And meet with the reviewer in that sense. And then kind of the final option, very related, very similar to the third option here, but the fourth option is what's called a mobile notary network. So instead of maybe a designated facility where our employee is going to go and schedule their appointment, instead they're going to be assigned an agent through a network, and that agent is going to go ahead and coordinate with the employee to designate a meeting place and a meeting time to where they can meet in person to have their documents reviewed. So the difference really is, option 3 is designated centers, facilities that the employee can schedule an appointment for. And option 4 is a mobile network of different notary agents where the employee is assigned a notary agent, and then they receive all the contact information for that person, and they kind of coordinate their meeting to have their documents verified or reviewed and verified, and then Section 2 would be completed, right? So you do have a lot of these different options available to you for this remote verification process, right? So again, big takeaways here. We can have the employee self-nominate their reviewer. Again, very useful in the case of, rural employees, or in this scenario that we have right now that we're facing as a nation, this pandemic. It's certainly a viable option. The second option is where we, HR, the employer, designates maybe a manager we have, that's close to the employee, or maybe a coworker, or anyone else that is to our knowledge that we would like to designate to complete Section 2 and even Section 3, right? So that's kind of the second option. And again, you do have these networks of remote agents that either they exist in these facilities called the PAN network, where the employee would self-schedule their own appointment. They kind of take care of it on their own, and it's actually a great system. You know, they get the calendar, you know, invite to stick it on their calendar on their iPhone or whatever, so they can keep track of it. But you know, they can self-schedule it again based on their zip code, and this is really available in most major cities and towns. And then of course the third party notary agent network, where it's a mobile agent network where the employee would get the contact information for their assigned agent, and then they would work to again kind of schedule the meeting place, the meeting time, and have their documents reviewed in person. So really, again, you do have a lot of options here, and we do support it. And so, you know, if you're not necessarily going with the DHS flexibility guidelines, you do have these options available to you as well. And so, you know, going a little bit more in depth for that self-nominated option. Remember, the remote agent can be a manager, it can be a coworker, or the new hire can nominate their person to be the reviewer. And in this particular scenario that we have, as Thomas mentioned, you know, they are allowing that the employee can designate, you know, a friend or a family member to act as their reviewer, so they can have that physical document verification step as part of the Section 2 review process, right? And you know, as a note, the government is not requiring anything of these authorized agents. You know, there's no specific qualifications that these agents need to have for completing Form I-9. It's just that, as Thomas mentioned, you know, the employer is ultimately liable for, you know, the accurate kind of completion of the I-9 record. But again, it's not mandatory that these agents have any qualifications. So it can really be anyone. And so as part of the process, you know, with these remote verification options, the agent needs to receive instructions on how the form should be completed, right? And you know, maybe as a refresher for them on all, you know, the compliance-based you know, guidelines for the I-9 verification process. And so again, you know, we recommend that the agent, if you're designating it as an employer, you know, it can be HR professional, librarian, you know, accountants, but you know, really these authorized agents, they can be even a notary public, where they're acting again on the behalf of the employer, and not as a notary. And so what that means is that the notary seal is actually not included in the Form I-9.
And Philip, if I may add, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things you do want to make sure is that, you know, if you're following the remote agent process, that agent very clearly understands what they're supposed to do. Not all of them understand the I-9, right? So your instructions to them has to be detailed enough, or maybe include a video on how to actually complete it. And typically those are little things that the system provider can do for you. But even if you're documented, let's say a quick PowerPoint to say, here are, you know, the most common documents to review. Here's how you complete Section 2. To attach something when you send it to that employee to say, please review this. Make sure that you follow these instructions on, so that you are more likely to get a more accurate and a more correct I-9 completed, so that it doesn't come up on an audit, you don't have an adverse action because it's incorrectly filled up. All those are important. So your written instructions to them from the very beginning the type of experience that you create for them, the knowledge base that you provide to them really becomes important for them to do a better job, because none of them would have been trained on it, right? So the step-by-step instructions you might have, any correction and audit checks that you may do in the physical process is definitely going to help to make sure that you have a more accurate I-9 in the system, right? So that's the big takeaway that typically we like to say when it comes to remote agent hiring. But if you have a form that will automatically tell them how to complete it, right? So even if you take that fillable I-9 PDF that you have today, that USCIS put on I-9 Central, and you just follow that instructions on that instead of handing that that straight the Adobe I-9 form that doesn't do those validations, it is still a better step than to leave them out to dry, right? So I would always recommend point them to the fillable form, let them complete section 1, let them go through with that employer agent or that person or the friend that they may be working at to complete section 2, because it's got a lot of those rules that are needed to complete section 2 of the form already built into that as a process. So even if you don't use any electronic provider such as mTrust or any other provider, in terms of a good guidance, just allowing them to start with that fillable I-9 form, I think is still a good start, better than you just giving a paper form and expecting them to complete it well. Okay? So Philip, let's go to the next slide here. What type of documents do you think, what type of documentation do you recommend that we retain, right? And what's the process here?
So, when you have a remote agent that is the reviewer for the Section 2 of the I-9, that person should scan a copy, of the employee's supporting documents that they used for the verification process, right? And this is really going to be helpful to the employer if the employer is participating in E-Verify. As if some of you participate in E-Verify, it's the electronic verification process that the government, the DHS, provides to employers to, confirm whether their employees are authorized, eligible to work in the United States. So for that purpose, sometimes E-Verify will ask you to match the photo that they present to you to the photo on the document that the employee has provided. And so for that reason, we are kind of recommending here that the remote agent, as part of the verification process, should scan a copy of that supporting document so that the employer can eventually have access to that and be able to do that step if they get to it in E-Verify. So again, either the remote agent should provide the copy of the supporting document directly to the employer, or if that's not the case, the employee should provide the copy of their documents, right? Also, as employers, as people operating in HR, right, you should have on hand the details of the remote agent that was used in the verification process to complete Section 2. And this is for any audit that you may have in the future, whether it's an internal audit or maybe the USCIS or ICE wants to see some of this information, right? It's definitely very important information to have on hand, and we do support that as well. And also, as good data security policies, right? You want to limit access to those records for this personal, identification information. So you really want to have that information kind of locked away in a secure place, so that not everybody necessarily has access to this very sensitive information that we're dealing with, right? Those are kind of the options or the recommendations we're making with the supporting documents when you're using a remote verification option here.
So, and if I may just add to what Philip was saying, right? If you look at why your forms may not be compliant, right? As one is you're not completing it within 3 days, Maybe part of it was that, it was incorrectly completed. And the third reason that you want to actually take a look at is what documents are you actually retaining, right? So one of the things you need to do as a company is to say, do you have a written policy for what documents are required and what will actually be stored as part of your I-9 store policy, right? So typically most legal team members would normally tend to say, do not retain more copies of document than what is required. And that's very important, right? So, but in certain cases, you're required to maintain documents. So for example, with E-Verify, if you do a US citizen today, because of the fact that you may get a DHS TNC notice and with a minor mistake, one of the requirements is to actually to scan the back and the front of it, and also the barcode page of that US passport. You're supposed to retain a copy, store it with your E-Verify record in case you're called to, provide it to them. And that's a good process to follow, by the way. And there's a similar requirements for EAD cards and for US green cards and so on, based on the citizenship type that is actually chosen, right? So one of the main things is to make sure that you have a documented I-9 policy related to what documents will be retained on your file. Do not over document, because if you look at several of the cases that have been out there where companies got fined, for example, one of the reasons they do get fined, in addition to not completing it in time, is for over documentation, or an employer claiming a discrimination because you asked them for a document that was maybe not required, or you asked them for additional documents. So having a document policy clearly stated and being made aware to team members who may be completing Section 2 becomes a very, very important step for you, right? The second part of it is that when you actually have allowing a remote agent to actually complete Section 2, right, and you take a photocopy of it and you're asking that agent to send it to you, they have a copy of somebody's social security card, or maybe the driving license that is not there, right? So one of the reasons you are actually asking them to go to a trained member is because they know what to do. So if you go to a PAN network data center, they are trained on it. They will take a copy of the document. They know where it is to be uploaded. The uploading is into your designated folder. It is not retained by the employee, right? Or if they're taking a copy, if everything else fails, one of the things that you can say is to ask the employee to actually say, here are the documents that they wish to present. And if they do change their minds, they can still present an alternative form of document, but it's just a recommendation that maybe you're giving some choices for the employee in terms of data protection, in terms of privacy of data. So you don't have these documents that are now lying with a third party or with a verifying agent. So little considerations for you in terms of what is the best practice for you in terms of record keeping documents in here, right? So, and if you look at, what some of those differences are, right, between a notary, for example, and this is just a slide to tell you what the differences are. And there are certain states, like such as in California, where a notary will not necessarily sign off on the I-9 because of statewide notary agent, requirements that might be in place, or things that they have decided not to do. So it's very important based on which state, where you can actually use different types of remote agents, for example, right? The most flexible options that we normally like to say provided by the self-nomination, or provided by HR choosing a co-worker or an HR manager or a senior team leader, maybe to complete Section 2, because that becomes a better process, because now it is still another employee of your company and not somebody else outside of the company, right? So you do have these choices that you can always make in terms of what is the best options for you, right? Now, some of your notaries, and this is one of the things we would emphasize, that if you're sending them to a notary, is that they or if you're telling them to go to your bank and find somebody who's a notary, make sure that they understand what is it that they're signing off. Most of them are used to stamping it with a notary seal. You should never have a notary seal on your I-9 document. That is most important, because it's taken to be a non-compliant form. right? So if you follow some of these steps and these outlines that we have provided, I think it will also lead to what we call a better compliance procedure for you when you're using some of these options. Even if these steps related to the national emergency is lifted and you continue to use them, make sure that you follow some of these guidelines and some of the better practices that we are stating out here. Okay. Now, one of the questions we actually get from a lot of people, and is what gives me the most coverage? Nothing beats a self-nomination, or nothing can beat your employee that works for you completing Section 2 for you if you cannot physically be present. Nothing can beat that, right? Because that's going to always have the widest amount of coverage that you have. Your first two options are always the widest two options. If they are in a major city, typically we would recommend, and this is just a recommendation, we don't play favorites between all of the vendors that might be integrated into a platform. We really like the process with the PAN network, not because of anything else, but because of the fact that the employee can self-schedule, they can pick a time, it is going to be a trained agent, and they know what they have to do. And secondly, even if they run late, for example, for an appointment, if there's an accommodation, based on the individual center's policy, they'll find a way to accommodate that person in spite of the fact that you may miss a related window. The other thing that you may be required to know is, your employees are going to make a mistake, right? And that happens often in this business. They said, I'm just going to take a photocopy because I don't want to take it with me when I travel to meet somebody. Unfortunately, they have to present an actual copy of the original document, not a photocopy, right? So the sender or the notary agent may send them back because they said, hey, we really want to see the original, not the photocopy. So if it is not somewhere, if it is very far from their home, if they cannot travel there quickly, obviously they have to now redo that appointment again. So just being aware of some of these instructions, that when you tell that employee what to do for Section 2 becomes very important for you as a company, making sure that your I-9s are more compliant, right? So I like the fact that if you look at it, almost all major cities, the large population areas are going to be covered through the PAN network. But if you look at the notary network, obviously you're going to find a lot of notaries pretty much across all of the great states that we have here in the United States. But again, these are just options that we're outlining. We have no preferences. Basically, if you do decide to make a choice, we will recommend what are best practices for you. We can give you guidance on what are the best steps to do here. Just be aware that coverage is more based on these choices that you may choose within the platform, or if you choose to work with somebody else. Having said that, let's take a quick look at a poll here before we go to next steps here. And if you have any questions, what I would normally say is, please make sure that you can absolutely update it. Let's take a quick look at it and see, are you currently using a remote agent processing here? So I'm going to distribute the poll out to you, and hopefully we'll get some responses back from you, right? So if you're actually using remote agents, you think it's something you are forced to do because of this emergency situation, obviously some options here for you.
Thomas, while we're waiting for the poll results, we do have a question submitted here. And so I see it says, I've completed an I-9 as an authorized agent, but the employer changed the information on the form I completed. Is that allowed?
Okay. I'm going to hold off on all questions maybe till this poll is actually completed. And
Okay.
then we can actually come back and start to look at some of these questions. Okay. Okay. So I think at this time we are going to close the poll. Thank you for those of you who actually voted. And I'm going to actually share it out. Okay. So a greater majority of you says, yeah, you have no intention of using a remote agent, absolutely fine. there are always options on the table for those of you who actually, see a need to use this. And some of you have actually been using this very successfully over the last couple of years or so. So I do see that. And I think we had a slightly lesser percentage say, yeah, we just started to use it because of the COVID-19 situation. Again, great feedback is very helpful for us. What I'm also going to do is, before we get there, take a look at some additional options here. And when I look at some of these additional options, let's take a quick look at some of these additional takeaways that you have, and then we will actually get to the questions that we have before we close out. Right? So other things to be aware of, because of, the closure impacts, just be aware that not all USCIS offices are working as normal. And that also affects your DHS TNC processes, or SSA TNC processes. Those offices are going to be closed, so they have limited availability. So those of you who are going to be impacted, please know that these are going to be extended, as per their guidance, to when it is actually going to be reopened back. So that 8-day limit that you actually have for the employee, always look for a final case result to come back from DHS before you make a decision on the DHS TNC or the SSA TNC, because you definitely want to actually give, DHS time to respond in this adverse situation right now, right? There could be delays with your H-1B process or with your extensions for that matter. In fact, I think last week, I think they came out with enhanced guidance. Automatic extensions are allowed in a majority of the cases. So please take a look at that additional guidance that has been provided. If an employee has got a work authorization document that proves identity, such as a DMV, a driving license, for example, and your local DMV is closed, what are options? And there for them to provide an alternate documentation. You may have to actually make these adjustments because of changes that are going on within your environment or because of your stay-at orders. Again, a physical copy or the fact that you have a document that might be a US passport obviously establishes identity, or an alternate form of documentation is very acceptable. So definitely choices you can present to the employee in terms of questions that you might have. Having said that, I think we have quite a few questions coming through.
So Thomas, just one question before you guys jump in. So you and Phil did a great job covering those 4 options that employers can adjust to during this time. Is there one that you feel that's the most effective process for employers right now, or is there one in particular that you're seeing? I mean, obviously we have the poll, but just in your experience, that one that most employers are utilizing.
I think we have seen an uptick in people using self-nominated, agents or self-nominated agents to complete Section 2 just because of the COVID-19 situation. So if you look at the last 30 to 45 days, we have seen a large uptick in people using that as an option. And that also aligns with the fact that, some of the PAN offices and the centers are closed. Goes back with somebody saying, hey, look, I don't, want to verify somebody in person, even if they're my next door neighbor, because I don't want to meet with them in this situation. A lot of people are just scared to meet with new people, right? So we have seen an uptick of that self-nominating, the friends and family type of an option, but remember, you're still as an option. So that's what I would call a temporary option right now. In fact, not a temporary, maybe even a better option if you're looking at controlling costs, making sure you're still compliant and you have the ability to audit and verify the documents coming in. It is still an option for you as an option, right? So that's my favorite option because that seems the most practical option at this time based on the current situation. I always like to physically inspect it. That's my preferred go-to method. And obviously with somebody trained to actually verify, that is my preferred method. But in today's situation right now, and what we are seeing with companies using our platform, we are seeing a large uptick of self-nominated verifying agents through the platform.
Thanks, Thomas.
Okay, so I think we might have a few questions. And I don't know where the question is because home state, I see only one question in here. Did I miss something in here? Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, so there was a question here on how do I become an authorized agent? I completed an I-9 as an authorized agent, but the employee changed the information in the form I-9 completed. Is that allowed? So I think those are actually two different questions. Okay. All right, so I'm not sure whether you're actually seeing my screen or not. So, but I think we had a couple of questions here. How do I become an authorized agent? Typically, for you to become an authorized agent, that's a tough question, right? So typically you will have to work with a provider. They'll have to provide you training for it. Or if you are a larger law firm or an attorney, sometimes we have companies who have nominated law firms or an HR professional to act for them in a specific cluster. If you're interested in knowing some of those options, I would say reach out to one of our team members here that you will see at the end of this conference slides, to Joseph Thomas, and he can absolutely take your information and allow you to become an authorized agent to act within the area that you are in. So definitely that's an option in here. I think we have another leading question, which is kind of a legalese question, as I like to call it, which is, if I, as the authorized agent, completed, completed an I-9, but the employee changed the information on the form I completed, is that allowed? And a big answer, it depends, right? So question is, what did they actually change, right? So if you look at, there are certain sections of the section 2. So if you look at it, if they actually updated their, the address of the company, for example, maybe you had the zip code wrong as a example, totally okay to do it. If you attached a copy of the document and you had misplaced or had a minor typo, such as in the document number, and they needed to make a correction for e-verify submission, and they confirmed it against the document that was submitted, we would say that is authorized, as long as they maintain an audit history of what that change was and who made that correction. So the audit history, the notes that you put in because of that correction, is very important to prove during an ICE audit, to say who made that correction, right? So it becomes very important that, the type of correction, who made that correction, the audit history behind it is fully documented, right? If, on the other hand, it's what we call a substantial change, where the employee claimed to be a citizen and it was not caught by Section 2, the reviewer, and the employee caught that part, the employer caught it when they looked and verified the document, I would say I would not feel so comfortable with that. That's just my personal opinion. It's not a legal opinion. I would rather that the employee make that correction, have that reviewed again for Section 2, and then actually have a corrected I-9 attached with the original in the system. So it kind of depends on what the process is. So the big answer, it depends on what is the correction that you are actually making. Okay. Dan Price, I think you wanted me to move my slide. Is there a workaround just for states that are in the shelter in place, or can it be for states that are at stay-at-home state? So that is, I think this applies, and this is a question from Denise Garcia. Thank you for that question. If you look at it, USCIS has made no distinction. It typically applies when you as a company made an option for your employees to work remotely because of the COVID-19 situation. So it's your policy, it's your company policy. We are allowing your employees to work from home. And it's a temporary measure during this national emergency. That's the big takeaway, but I don't think it discriminates between a stay-at-home order versus a shelter-in-place order. Next question, is the workaround just for states? I think you asked the question. And I think, Deanna, you had a question such as they removed my name if I never completed the form. The documents were fine. That's more of a leading question. I don't want to answer right on this phone right now. So I think that's about all of the questions that you had, unless you have anything in the chat session. Oh, Thomas, we are still in the poll screen. Okay, got it. I'm so sorry that you're still in my polling screen. Let me go back in there and actually take a look at what we can do to actually show that little section, okay? Having said that, we are at the end of our time. Thank you for all of you that actually joined us. I hope you found the information useful. We are actually going to be, hold on. Going to be closing out at this time, but there's some additional information for you on how to contact Dawn. Dawn and ESR has been great partners, but you can also, get some of our services through some great partners such as PDS, Vista HRMS, through ADP. These are all options that you have as a company to actually reach out and, get some of our solutions for within it, whether it's onboarding, whether it's through our talent acquisition platform, through a Form I-9 and E-Verify. All of these are options for you to actually see all of that within the platform. Okay, so thank you again. We appreciate all of you that actually came through in the system, and look forward to talking to you or seeing you on another webinar shortly. Thank you again. Bye for now.